So I'm Julia Spania. I am a co-facilitator of the youth working group of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. And I give my warmest welcome to everyone. Welcome to the CFS chair, who I seen has just joined. It's great to have you. Welcome to all CFS member states and all other CFS participants who are joining us right now. Thanks so much to Stefania Tripodi and Emma Silibrandi for joining us as speakers. It's wonderful. That's really great that you could do that. And of course, welcome to all CSIPM members from other working groups and constituencies who are showing their support in that sense. Also, thank you, Paula Gioia, to join us as a speaker from the Gender Diversity Working Group of the CSIPM. So today, we, the CSIPM youth, we are hosting this public briefing to share and explain our positions in the negotiations for the CFS Policy Recommendations on youth engagement and employment in agricultural systems. And as the first round of negotiations has been completed, and we are about to enter the second round, we deem it an important moment to share in more detail and during a very time-constrained negotiations what our priorities are and which topics are non-negotiable to us. So just to give you a very quick overview, the briefing is organized in the following sense. Very simple. 6 youth from the CSIPM will present our perspective on the different sections of the draft policy recommendations. So from the rationale to recommendation 5. And then during this, we will invite Stefania Tripodi from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Paula Gioia from the CSIPM Gender Diversity Working Group, and Emma Silibrandi from who is an agriculture officer from the FAO for their commentary. And all interventions will last approximately 3 to maximum 5 minutes. And then at the end, we hopefully still have time for a brief Q&A, for which you're already invited to write questions into the chat already during the course of the briefing, if that is easier for you. And now, just as I see that more people joined while I was speaking, there is interpretation in English, French, and Spanish for this call. So you can just choose the language at the bottom of the window. And this meeting is being recorded, so just for your information. Okay, and now I will already pass the word to present the CSIPM perspective on the rationale of the policy recommendation. And Tyler, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I'm Tyler Short, a small-scale food in the United States and a coordinator of the CSIPM Youth, representing the international peasant movement La Via Campesina. The CSIPM really engaged in this policy process from the beginning, and we've seen some improvements in the text of the recommendations through the first round of negotiations. However, there are still some major gaps and a few troubling aspects in the text. And we believe that a total of 6 days for negotiations will certainly not be enough to engage in substantive debate. So what's the most significant gap in these recommendations? The HLPE report on youth provided the CFS with key conclusions that are almost entirely absent in the current draft being negotiated. And this is deeply concerning, as the mandate and the integrity of the CFS are under attack by a bloc of powerful exporting countries, which oppose inclusion of text that signals the need for a profound transformation of food and agriculture. The USA's position is particularly alarming, as they have stated that any reference to the report, if included at all, must be bland. In other words, to say nothing about the progressive content. This is very shameful and totally
public briefing.
As we will highlight,
it's a public briefing.
Patty, could you please mute yourself? Thanks. As we'll highlight in the briefing, specific human rights and human rights instruments that delineate them should be clearly integrated within the recommendations. The rights enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas require specific attention. In line with the CSIPM's position during the two most recent policy processes of the CFS, we're going to maintain a red line against the following caveat included before the list of declarations, treaties, covenants, and conventions toward the beginning of both documents. The caveat: these guidelines and recommendations are intended to be applied consistent with the following instruments as far as each of these instruments are relevant and applicable, and as far as they have been agreed, acknowledged, and or endorsed by respective member states. This caveat not only jeopardizes the mandate of the CFS, it undermines international law as well as the procedures of the UN system as a whole. And so, as one of our speakers will address later in the briefing, these recommendations must go beyond language that's confined to gender binaries. References to young women and men, boys and girls has to be enhanced by including reference to other persons historically subjected to discrimination based on their gender identity and/or sexual orientation. We want to make clear that youth and all their diversities must be recognized, and denying these diversities truly amounts to denying the existence of youth who are non-binary, transgender, homosexual, and all other diversities beyond cis heteronormativity. During the first round of negotiations, one of the most contentious debates centered around the terms decent work and dignified livelihoods. The United States was especially vocal against the notion of dignified livelihoods, and we really believe that this opposition is rooted in their rejection of the HLPE report, which presented a conceptual framework for transitioning toward economies of well-being based on dignified livelihoods, healthy environments, and food sovereignty. For us, human dignity and dignified livelihoods are not negotiable. Finally, reference to local and territorial markets was a major point of contention. In this time of compounding crises, these policy recommendations must include reference to food sovereignty as a structural solution for radically transforming social, economic, and political relationships and conditions within and across countries. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through socially just and ecologically sound methods. It's our right to define and control our own food and agricultural systems. Since our movement was founded 30 years ago, La Via Campesina has fought against the WTO and free trade agreements, which destroy the livelihoods of small-scale food producers and the ecosystems upon which we all depend. Food sovereignty is especially relevant now, as the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine threaten the food security of many nations, especially food importing countries and countries unjustly burdened with external debt. The report from the FAO Council's 170th session makes a very strong case for states to exit the WTO and implement food sovereignty and peasants' rights as solutions to the current crises. The FAO's Food Price Index reached a new historical high in March 2022. Nearly 50 countries are dependent on Russia and Ukraine for at least 30% of their wheat import needs. And of these, 26 countries source over 50% of their wheat imports from the two countries. In terms of world output, more than 50% of sunflower oil derives from Russia and Ukraine. Russia is also the world's top exporter of nitrogen fertilizers, the second leader of potassium fertilizers, and the third largest exporter of phosphorus fertilizers. As the report from the FAO states, this war has sent shockwaves throughout global markets. When food markets are already struggling with soaring prices and challenges faced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So today, we're here to say, now is the time to transform. There's no future without food sovereignty and agroecology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Right, I just immediately pass on the word to continue with recommendation 1. So please, Seifu Sani, do you want to share the reflections of our working group on recommendation 1?
Thank you very much, Julia. Yes, I will in a few minutes. So on the recommendation 1, we're speaking about providing an enabling environment for youth engagement and employment. And first of all, just to state that an enabling environment is based on the realization and the protection of human rights. And even now, when we talk about human rights, also, we want to engage women and youth rights as well. And these recommendations must be grounded in the CFS mandate and vision to achieve a world which is free from hunger. And the recommendations need to identify the realization of the right to food as the overarching objective for this policy convergence process. We consider the multiple layers of food crisis that stem from, historical inequalities, systemic oppression, COVID-19, as Tyler has spoken of, and the war in Ukraine. And of course, the war in Ukraine has affected the world in a big way. And the right to food sovereignty is a precondition for food security, and it's needed now more than ever. An enabling environment entails much more than policies, laws, and institutions, which are intended to realize and protect human rights, needs, and aspirations of the youth, including young women. And the enabling environments should also be described in terms of the physical environments in which the youth live and work, which include the climate change, which is one of the greatest threats to humanity, especially for poor people and the marginalized groups. Industrial agribusiness, which is largely to blame because of high external input, resource intensive. All right, I'll go a bit slowly so that everybody can understand what I'm saying. Apologies. So industrial agribusiness, which is largely to blame because there's high external input. Resource intensive agricultural systems have caused massive deforestation, water scarcities, biodiversity loss, soil depletion, and dangerous levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And because of this, there's high external input into the environment, and this of course affects the food productivity in the different areas. In October 2021, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. Article 18 of the UN DROP also recognizes the right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment to use and manage. And of course, this all goes back to the environments that we need. We need a good environment to be able to enable the environment in which the youth live, to be able to work and even to be productive, in food production. Another point is the economic exploitation, political marginalization, land grabs, armed conflict, occupation, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which prevent the youth from enjoying an enabling environment, of course, which would permit the realization of our rights to life, rights to liberty, rights to security. The fifth point is on the disruptions of the livelihoods of the youth, which can be prevented by increasing the resilience of food systems, through the diversification, excuse me, of food production capacities at the national level, of course, and this is just enabling the people to be able to produce, food at large scale in their own countries, for them to have, their own food security and food sovereignty, and strengthening the capacity of local and regional markets, such that even when the farmers from these regions are marketing them, then they have the markets which they can go to. And transition towards less energy intensive forms, barriers to youth engagement, which include structural racism, sexual and gender-based violence, and also socioeconomic inequality, the heterogeneity and intersectionality of the youth, policy programs to support youth in leadership and participation, and even to be part of the leadership in their countries, and legal mechanisms and normative institutions are needed for the youth to hold duty bearers and to be accountable. And finally, a significant redistribution of power, knowledge, and resources is needed to transform existing socio, political, and economic relationships and conditions within and across the countries. I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Seifu. That was great. Just to add, Seifu is the co-coordinator of our working group. I think that was not mentioned at the beginning. So now, still staying with recommendation 1 and with what has been said so far, I would like to invite Stefania Tripodi to comment on the role of human rights in the policy recommendations and on what has been discussed so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you to the civil society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism for inviting the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to the public briefing. The office has followed with interest the negotiations of the policy recommendations and sees them as an opportunity to find policy coherence between the commitments of states on food security and human rights, their human rights obligations, and to find this policy coherence in the area of food security specifically. So I was thinking of sharing with you basically 3 main observations. One related to the concept of human dignity that I've seen that had a lot of discussions during the negotiations. One related to the instrument of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and people living in rural areas, and the third one on the specific caveat the states are introducing in the policy recommendations. So on human dignity as a concept has been elaborated in the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And in the declaration, it was stated that human dignity was inherent to human beings that are born free and equal. And we find this concept coming back in the different human rights treaties, from preambles to articles, because it gives significance to the content of the right. And we find it in for example, when we look at the right to an adequate standard of living, we find it there specifically to give meaning of what it means, that adequate standard of living, that then it resonates, for example, in the area of the right to food, or in the area, for example, also of the right to work. We're speaking now, and also thanks to the work of ILO, of a right to decent work. So not all work is accepted as decent work. So there, it's really the meaning of human dignity. And I think it would be really important that the policy recommendations acknowledge that, and they qualify the language and the different policy recommendation aiming at ensuring that human dignity. So, for example, a dignified livelihoods that can also be translated well as decent work or fair and safe conditions. And these are discussions that states have had within the human rights bodies, but also within the ILO bodies. So I think that it's an important point that the policy recommendations should reflect. On UNDROP, of course, so the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the rights of peasants, we find that it's a declaration that was approved by adopted by the General Assembly, and basically, even if it's not legally binding per se yet, it really shows the dynamics of international law. Human rights treaties are binding once they're ratified by states. Declarations, UN declarations, they give also an interpretation of the different articles in the human rights instruments. And the declaration, as I said, set up the direction of international human rights or human rights law. And then it would be really important, since it's an instrument of 2018 that is included in the policy recommendations or recalled in the policy recommendations, because it has to do really with the content of these policy recommendations. It has to do with youth in rural areas, with small-scale farmers and others working in rural areas. So it would be a missed opportunity not to include such a specific declaration that has expressed the direction the states are taking through the adoption at the UN General Assembly. And finally, on the caveat as the CSIPM said very eloquently, not only it's not in line, it's not helpful for the advancement of the understanding of certain concepts, like, for example, those related to human dignity, but it's incorrect in the sense that it doesn't reflect how international law evolves and how international law is actually comes into play at the international level, in the sense that it doesn't, this caveat doesn't take into consideration international customary law. So there might be specific provisions that states might not have adhered to, but they became, with the state's practice, they became international human rights law. For example, violence against women, gender-based violence in general, was not expressly included in the, for example, Convention on the Elimination of all discrimination, of all forms of discrimination against women, but through the work of the committee on the monitoring body, the CEDAW, that monitors the implementation of the covenant. The body has exemplified that violence against women, it's actually a gender-based violence, it's actually a form of discrimination. And so that has entered into international law, and also through a UN declaration on violence against women. So in saying, and I will just read it, in saying, it will be enough in saying, as far as each of these instruments are relevant and applicable, instead of saying how they've been agreed, acknowledged, and endorsed by respective member states, because it doesn't, international customary law doesn't apply only to those states that have had the right or the compatible states practice, but it applies to all. So I hope that that was helpful, and I look forward to the discussion in the debate.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful, of course. Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful. And yeah, I will now just, for reasons of brevity, just already directly pass it on again and pass it on to Paola Gioia. Yeah, thanks so much for adding your reflections.
Yes, hello. First of all, thanks to the CSIPM youth for the invitation to the Women and Gender Diversity Working Group to share some elements here as well. No? As non-binary gender peasant farmer, I've been engaging in the negotiations process on the guidelines on gender running in parallel to that one. Both CSIPM working groups see many intersectional elements between the two processes and also needs for improvements if the CFS truly wants to make steps forward to protect and to ensure the rights of the concerned ones. And if both policy products are intended to be meaningful for the communities on the ground. I come originally from Brazil, and during my young age, I faced several structural and social discriminations, as well as mental violence for being who I am. As many other non-binary gender persons or LGBTQI plus folks, I got mental sick because of the discriminations I faced, and ultimately I had no other chance than to migrate, searching for a life in peace and for healing. Research have shown that the social, cultural, and structural discriminations suffered by LGBTQI plus people lead them to higher levels, higher rates of poverty compared to their heterosexual counterparts. And that especially LGBTQI plus youth who face rejection from their families, homelessness, and mental instability. And it is also obvious that similar to what happened to the women, their situation of vulnerability, suffering gender and sexual-based violences at home also increased during the lockdowns of the COVID-19 pandemic. The discriminations and the violence that we face often force the global gender and sexual diverse youth to migrate, fleeing from misogynist, homophobic environments and seeking for a place where we can have our basic rights guaranteed, including our right to food and our right to life. In agriculture, rural LGBTQI plus youth around the globe is regularly confronted with predefined gender roles and tasks according to one's biological body characteristics. In agriculture, roles and tasks are often based on a dichotomous gender division of society. Not fulfilling these norms have often drastic consequences for young members of a family farm or of a rural community, for example. So in many contexts, this is one of the main reasons for a silenced rural exodus of younger generations. LGBTQI plus youth don't merely choose migration from rural areas. Migration is often resistance in order to survive. Therefore, the current policy recommendations on youth need to name and make visible LGBTQI plus young small-scale food producers. They are also contributing to food security and nutrition while often facing multiple forms of discrimination in the current food system. Having said that, intersectionality is a key element to be highlighted here. Discriminations and violences due to age, gender and sexual diversity, disabilities, race and ethnicity, status, and also many other characteristics, when they are combined together, they lead often to even bigger discriminatory behaviors. I'm also a member of La Via Campesina, and La Via Campesina, as the global peasant movement, initiated processes in different regions around the globe towards the visibility, the inclusion, and strengthening of gender and sexual diverse peasants, landless people, migrant workers, and youth in rural areas, and in the agriculture sector in general. And we have seen how much the LGBTQI plus rural youth has been responding to that. They exist, and young generations around the globe are no longer willing to deny it. It is time to come together and to talk about the different layers of discriminations and violences that we face. In many countries are not addressed, and in some others are even supported by the current policies. Each of us have personal stories of being silenced, suffer, of strategies to survive. And even if part of us have positive stories of coming out or acceptance, we all share the suffer and the anger of our siblings who have been killed, who have been attacked, imprisoned, or who took their lives for being who they are. We are not mere diverse individuals in diverse bodies. We are part of a global community who has been historically subjected to discriminations based on our gender identities and sexual orientations. Such social dynamics are clear results from patriarchy and must be collectively addressed, leading to public policies capable to address the human rights violences that we face. And this also belongs into the policy recommendations on promoting youth engagement and employment in agriculture and food systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Yeah, that was a crucial words on that issue, and having emphasized how that needs to be added in those policy recommendations. So that's wonderful that you made the mention. Okay, now we are reaching the next recommendation, recommendation 2. And here I'm happy to give the floor to Krishnakar Kumari, who will, I'm sure, present himself. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair Julia, for the floor. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I am Krishnakar Kumari from Mijark, from South India, Telangana state. I am a young farmer, small-scale producer, and I am also a social activist, especially working on the youth and agriculture issues. Okay, while youth are in the front line of building sustainable food systems, they also bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change, as well as social and economic inequalities. And they frequently lack rewarding and meaningful work on adequate livelihood opportunities, according to the HLP report 2021. So my recommendation 2, secure dignified, attractive, and rewarding livelihoods for youth. Dignified and rewarding livelihoods fundamentally depend on the realization and protection of human rights. The rights relating to life, liberty, equality, and dignity of the individual guaranteed. Specifically, UNDROP, workers' rights, peasants' rights, and rights of indigenous peoples. Employability of youth is important to consider, but these policies recommendations must emphasize that youth also seek self-employment and other forms of productive work in collectives, cooperatives, associations, and culturally specific arrangements that diverge from the dominant economy of capitalist enterprises and wage labor. So as per our previous speaker mentioned that the ILO, International Labour Organization, very clearly working on the Sustainable Development Goals number 8 on decent work and economic growth. So I would like to relate with this topic that labor policies and regulations should ensure living wages. So every labor, wherever they work, they need to have the security at workplace, social protection, better prospects for personal development and social integration, the rights to organize, the freedom of expression, and participation in the decision making. So it's important to have social security at workplace, safety and health, and elimination of exposures and sexual and gender-based violence. So recognizing the compensating and redistributing unpaid work performed by the youth is the fundamental to securing identified the livelihoods. So we have two types of unpaid workers are that youth performed by young women need specific attention, and education, healthcare, childcare, parental leave, and community services are essential elements for social protection. So effective abolition of child labor is very, very important. I think this is the recommendation too. I would like to emphasize more on this point. However, these policies recommendations should also identify the structural cause that force children to engage in work. So by that way, they harm their physically, mentally, spiritual, moral, and social developments. Structural poverty, land and resources grabs, and gender-based discriminations are also major reasons why families might rely on their children to generate income before they reach legal working age. Strengthening informal enterprises, popular economies, and alternative food systems is vital to ensure decent working conditions and dignified livelihoods for all. Following from the HLPE report 13 principles and the FAO's 10 elements, agroecology must be identified as distinct. So agroecology is a science with the traditional practice and local knowledge of food producers, and it's a movement. Agroecology is not aimed to reform unsustainable agricultural systems, but it's a transform the social, political, and economical structures to achieve food sovereignty and social justice. Instead, agroecology aims to transform the food systems by addressing the root cause of problems in an integrated way that provides holistic and long-term solutions with an explicit focus on social and economic dimensions of food systems and a strong grounding in the rights of women, youth, peasants, workers, and indigenous peoples. So I am working in Mijak International. Movement was founded in 1954. Almost we are finishing 67 years. Our endless supporting to the young rural youth all over the world in 35 countries, promoting youth in agriculture, and also we are struggling and fighting against the corporate systems, which is destroying the food systems and agriculture scenarios. Thank you very much. Over to Chair.
Thanks so much, Chris. Excellent. Yeah, wonderful. I am already again handing it over. So yeah, please, Emma Silibrandi, who's an agriculture officer from the FAO. Yeah, very much welcome again. Yeah, please share your reflections. I think we particularly invited you to speak on the role of agroecology in the policy recommendations. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, the CSIPM, for inviting me, and also for providing this space to, in a very transparent way, to show your position on this negotiation. I think this is an amazing space for discussions and for exchange our points of view. Well, I don't think it's necessary to highlight the importance of youth in the food system transformation. And that's why the CFS promoted this HLPE report on how youth could be, the issues of youth could be addressed in the discussion of food system transformation. And it was also why CFS promoted the discussions on agroecology 2 years ago, and many of you were involved on this discussion. That's a reason for this. No, we know that the 2030 agenda for sustainable development calls for bold and transformative steps, which are urgently needed to shift the world on a sustainable and resilient path. And this is proposed at the same time that we should realize the human rights of all, which means leaving no one behind. And this is very important to keep in mind. That is an agreed formula in UN system that came from the establishment of the 2030 agenda. So all the CFS recommendations, policy recommendations on agroecology and other innovative approaches talks a lot about youth people. You know that there are references to youth people among the most affected by hunger, malnutrition, and rural poverty. And almost all recommendations of the policy recommendations on agroecology. No? But we know that we should also recognize that youth people are part of the solutions for the challenges that humanity is facing. If they have enough opportunities, for instance, for a better education, access to productive resources, decent jobs, etc., non-discrimination, and all these things. So we should not see young people only as people that are facing discrimination and they are facing challenges, etc. They are, of course, affected by the current situation, and we have to acknowledge the inequalities that young people face, but we have to go beyond that and ensure conditions to them to fully participate in the construction of a new, fairer, and more sustainable food systems. We are convinced in our sector, in our team, that agroecological proposals would be the best way to achieve this. So we think that agroecology is a good proposal for youth people also. And as you know, since 2014, FAO is working on this. And we have some mandates gave to us by the governing bodies, such as in 2018, the COAG recommended that we should prepare a working plan for the Scaling Up Agroecology initiative based on the 10 elements of agroecology, which the 10 elements of agroecology also were approved in 2019 by the Council of FAO, and in the conference in 2019, it was also approved a resolution requesting FAO to integrate agroecology to other sustainable approaches. So we are following those mandates. We have this order, we should say, from the governing bodies that we have to work and we have to provide information. We have to provide technical assistance to countries, etc., on agroecology. And just as examples, no, the discussion of the 10 elements of agroecology was made in a global multi-stakeholder consultation, and it was very participatory. It was not something that came out from FAO alone. it was discussed with several research, academic sector, practitioners, farmers, etc. So this is the way we are working. Now we also elaborated in the same way the tool for agroecology performance evaluation, that is a multidimensional assessment tool to produce global evidence on how agroecology perform in the country experiences. We are working in more than 30 countries on that. We are also giving technical assistance to many countries in line with their national priorities. So we are really engaged in scaling up agroecology in all our world. I would like to mention, for just to contribute to the discussion, an article that our colleagues Edmundo Barrios and several colleagues from FAO, including myself, we published in the journal Ecosystems and People in 2020, and I can give you the link in the chat afterwards, that in which we have a session totally dedicated to the education, governance, youth employment nexus. So this is one of the way we see how agroecology can be useful for the countries if they have they pay enough attention to the youth engagement on this. On the other hand, I would like to highlight that agroecology has been recognized in several other global fora as a key concept for inclusive food system transformation. And one example of that, besides the CFS itself, is the Coalition for Food Transformation that came out from the UN Food System Summit last year. So we have now FAO signed the coalition. We have now 33 countries and 61 organizations that are part of this coalition. And one of the main objectives of the coalition is the dissemination of the CFS recommendation on agroecology and other innovative approaches. So I would like just to highlight how agroecology and youth are connected. And for FAO, for CFS, and for instance, for the coalition on agroecology that we are working with right now. So yes, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. That was yeah, extremely interesting, and yeah, thanks so much for sharing all that knowledge. Yes, so I'm seeing we're running a bit late. So while I already asked Moise to share our perspectives on recommendation 3, so Moise, you can already get ready. I would also like to ask if it will be fine for the interpreters to stay on for 5 more minutes so we can interpret all our interventions. You can just let me know, or maybe Martin or Julia can check that on my behalf from the CSIPM Secretariat. That would be wonderful. But now I give the floor directly to Moise. Moise, the floor is yours.
Merci Julia, bonjour à tous, suivant là où vous trouvez.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. My name is Moise Mbimbe from the Association Action for Community Development, which is based in Cameroon. We support peasants in defending their rights to land and other natural resources so that they can preserve their livelihoods and live with dignity from their agricultural activities. In this respect, recommendation number 3 is of particular concern to us. Indeed, we see in this recommendation an opportunity to call for comprehensive and profound agrarian reform that promotes equitable access, sustainable use, conservation, and the protection of land, water, seeds, biodiversity, fisheries, and forests. We believe that redistributive land reform must ensure that all necessary support is provided, such as access to credit, crop insurance inputs, markets, technical assistance, housing, and agricultural development. This support is particularly important in the African context, where it is difficult to produce sufficient food. In our opinion, land reforms must be participatory and transparent, and they must prioritize the poor, women, indigenous peoples, and other disadvantaged groups. States must promote land justice by banning arbitrary and illegal forced evictions, the destruction of agricultural land, and other punitive measures that expropriate peasants and indigenous peoples from their lands and resources. States must therefore protect village lands. They must fight against land grabbing of various kinds. More land justice would mean the release of millions of hectares of land that could benefit young people in rural areas. They are currently suffering from an unfavorable balance of power, given the presence of companies and elites. In addition to land reform, we attach particular importance to short distance food supply chains. We believe that these deserve special attention in these recommendations. In fact, many young people embark into small-scale agriculture with a specific interest in specific systems that increase the direct connections between producers and consumers. This allows them to have better incomes. In this regard, we believe that community-supported agriculture, urban and peri-urban agriculture, food baskets, and public procurement programs supporting local markets are essential to enable young people to receive fair remuneration for their products. Thank you. Back to the floor.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Moise, and thanks also so much for being concise. Yeah, that's great for the time we have. And now I'm happy to again pass it already on to recommendation 4, which will be presented by Carson Kiburo. The floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much. As you've heard, my name is, as you can see also, my name is Carson Kiburo, founder and executive director at Jamii Hasilia Center. I'm an indigenous rights advocate and doing community organizing. I work on the areas of climate change, biodiversity, agro-pastoralism, as a pastoralist myself, and the nexus in intergenerational knowledge system sharing. I am also a law student, and I am an alternate coordinator of this mechanism, right, as you listen to us. So really grateful for all of you to give us your ears and to listen to our priorities today. So I'll try, in the interest of time, I will try to pass on quickly to our ideas on item number 4, which is to enhance equitable access to knowledge, education, and skills of the youth. As we all know that education is basic human rights. It's enshrined, as you've heard from all our colleagues, quoting Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And specifically here, I would like to mention Article 26, sub-Article 2, which is the education shall be directed to the full development of human personality. Most importantly, education should also focus on responsibilities of individuals to their communities and societies more broadly. That involves the promotion of understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all peoples of nations. The second point in this item number 4 is about the COVID-19 pandemic, which, as we all know, has disrupted education all over the world. The school continuity can be ensured during these emergencies that we're undergoing. We see the re-emergence of more strains, but access to long-distance learning, which relies on equal access to communications, technology, and broadband internet. Most importantly, we would like to mention also another item on policies requiring school attendance, which, as we see right now, they're not enough. As we've seen in CEDAW General Recommendations 34 on the rights of rural women, you've heard from my colleague Moise mentioning about rural people. So most importantly, the rural women, and on that 6, that is recommendation that 6 on the rights of girls and women to educations. So rural girls may be victims to child and forced marriage, and also experience sexual harassment and violence in and out of educational settings, which may force them to drop out of school. So quite importantly, we need to focus on policies requiring school attendance on rural girls, which has shortened due to domestic and care work, such as cooking. These might sound very obscure, but they're very important to rural people. I mean, in terms of issues, the cooking, childcare, farm work, fetching water, firewood, all those issues. And sub-item number 3 on policies, as you've heard from also our colleague Paula, we would like to mention on lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and intersex students that require particular attention because of bullying, harassment, and threats against them that constitute barriers to the rights of education. Because of time, I'm going to be rushing to another item, which is multidisciplinary educational curriculum development that is needed in order for the youth to learn about subjects related to sustainable agriculture and food systems. Also, youth-led research and community-based research partnerships should prioritize the development of methodologies that integrate diverse knowledges and the diversity of ways of knowing and communicating. Another thing is about the training and vocational programs that are needed for youth to develop the skills related to food education, food protection, and preparation, and environmental stewardship, which includes collaborative assessments of local community needs, rural and urban agroecology schools. You've heard about my colleagues in Latin American agroecology institutes of Via Campesina that provide examples of how to combine individual and group study with community-based work that directly distributes to increasing food security and realizing the rights to food sovereignty. And last but not least, as stated in Article 25 of UNDROP, peasants and other people working in rural areas have the right to adequate training suited to specific agroecological, sociocultural, and economic environments which they find themselves in. I want to thank you all for listening, even though I rushed through my prepared statement. But thank you so much for giving us your time and to listen to our priorities as have been mentioned by my colleagues that came before me. Thank you so much, Julia, for wonderful moderation, and to the interpreters as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carson. Excellent. Yes, and so again, thanks so much to the interpreters for staying with us for a few more minutes. And yeah, Flavia, the floor is yours. I'm sure you'll do a great short intervention. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Julia. I'm Flavia. I'm an international cooperation student, and I work in the Society for International Development as an intern. So recommendation 5 currently focuses heavily on the digitalization of agriculture. We do understand that technological innovation is an important aspect of the current food system. However, we do believe that it needs balance between old and new system of knowledge and practices as they are referred to by the HRP report. Real innovation in agriculture and food system should focus on the democratization of society and be based on cooperation and solidarity, because as the HLP report clearly stated, the potential benefits and risks of internet and communication technologies depend entirely on the context of their application. So it's also evident that ongoing digital divides must be overcome to prevent their benefits from remaining concentrated among those with more access to financial capital and be truly accessible to all youth. The environmental and also psychological impacts of technology needs to be considered in this regard. And we do believe that this recommendation on innovation should be focused on the promotion of participatory processes and institutional innovation that can contribute to an agroecological transition that is actually inclusive for the most affected by food insecurity and malnutrition. Inclusivity and sustainability should be key to any innovation promoted by the CFS. However, the current draft does not adequately reflect these principles. To do so, the recommendation should draw from the FAO 10 elements of agroecology, particularly to highlight agroecological innovation, which are based on the co-creation of knowledge, such as the peasant-to-peasant movement. To conclude, and sorry for being so short, we urge for an equitable use of digital technologies in agriculture and food system, and we firmly believe that to do so, they should be subject to the direct control of food producers. Small food producers, indigenous people, and other people working in rural areas with their sovereignty, their knowledges, and their practices should be recognized and protected, while their centrality in the production process should be really strengthened. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Julia, for your wonderful facilitation, and thank you for the interpreter for staying late.
Thanks so much, Flavia. Excellent and perfectly staying in time. Yes, so we keep it short. Thanks so much to everyone for joining our public briefing. Thanks so much to everyone who spoke, Tyler, Seifu, Chris, Moise, Carson, and Flavia, for speaking on our perspectives of CSIPM youth. Thanks so much for Emma, Stefania, and Paula for sharing your expertise and your demands with regards to some of the key elements that should form the CFS policy recommendations on youth. And to conclude, of course, thanks so much to the interpreters for staying a bit over time with us. Thanks for everyone else who stayed over time with us, the CFS, like the member states and other participants of the CFS. And we hope that as the CFS chair, thanks again also for joining us. As the chair wrote in the chat, we hope that member states delegates will bear the views and experiences and knowledge that was shared here in mind when negotiating the recommendations. So thanks so much, everyone. Hope to see you soon. Thank you.